Junior Olympic swim team. Vanished in 1992, 20 years later, their coach found this on the shore. Section 1. Cold Open, Shoreline Discovery. The seaweed clung to Coach Marcus Whitaker's ankles like cold fingers as he waded through the pre-dawn shallows of Clearwater Bay. 20 years of guilt had driven him here every August 15th, the anniversary, but this morning felt different. The water seemed to whisper his name. He'd aged poorly. Gray stubble covered a face that had once been featured in Swimming World magazine as Coach of Tomorrow. Now he looked like a man haunted by yesterday. The guilt had carved deep lines around his eyes, lines that deepened every time someone mentioned the Clearwater Six. That's what the media had called them. 6 promising young swimmers who vanished without a trace during what should have been their final practice before nationals. No bodies, no evidence. Just empty water and a coach who couldn't explain how he'd lost his entire team. Marcus bent down to untangle his foot from the seaweed, and that's when he saw it. A glint of silver caught in the kelp. His breath caught in his throat. A whistle. Not just any whistle, but the whistle. The one he'd personally engraved for team captain Sarah Chen. His hands trembled as he pulled it free, wiping away 20 years of ocean grime. The inscription was still there, barely visible but unmistakable. Come back strong, Coach W. But it was what was inside the whistle that made his knees buckle. Rolled tight and somehow preserved despite decades underwater was a piece of paper. With shaking fingers he unrolled it. The handwriting was Sarah's. He'd seen it on enough permission slips and training logs to recognize those careful, precise letters anywhere. But the message made no sense. They took the deep line. Find the 7th. The 7th? What? There had only been 6 swimmers. Section 2. Flashback, the final swim practice. August 15th, 1992, the morning had been perfect. Marcus remembered every detail with the clarity that comes from reliving trauma 1,000 times. Crystal blue sky, water like glass, his 6 swimmers lined up on the dock in their matching Clearwater Bay warm-ups. All right, team, he'd called, out, clipboard in hand. This is it, last practice before nationals. Sarah, you're leading the warm-up circuit. 3 miles out to the marker buoy and back. Stay tight, stay together. Sarah Chen had nodded, adjusting her goggles with the methodical precision that made her the best butterfly swimmer in the state. At 17, she was heading to Stanford, on a full scholarship, or had been, before the bay swallowed her whole. What about the weather report, Coach? That was Tommy Martinez, barely 16, but built like a freight train. Mom said there might be fog rolling in. Marcus had checked the marine forecast that morning. Clear skies predicted through noon. Weather's fine, Tommy. Trust your coach. The words echoed in his mind now like an accusation. Trust your coach. The coach who lost 6 kids in calm water. He'd watched them dive in, Sarah's perfect form cutting through the surface like a blade, followed by Tommy, then quiet Beth Morrison, cocky Jake Sullivan, determined Amy Foster, and finally little Danny Park, the youngest at 14 but with a heart bigger than swimmers twice his size. They'd been strong. They'd been ready. They'd been his responsibility. Marcus remembered checking his watch. 8:47 a.m. The swimmers were halfway to the marker buoy when the fog bank appeared on the horizon like a gray wall. It moved faster than fog should move, rolling across the bay with unnatural speed. Sarah, he'd called through his megaphone. Fog incoming. Turn around. That's when he'd heard the whistle, sharp, piercing, echoing across the water. But his whistle was still hanging around his neck. Who had blown the signal to return? Section 3. Present day. The letter decoded. Marcus sat in his truck outside the Clearwater Bay Coast Guard station. Sarah's note spread on his dashboard. They took the deep line. Find the 7th. The words had haunted him through a sleepless night. Lieutenant Commander Ray Vasquez had been a rookie Coast Guardsman in 1992, one of the first responders to Marcus's frantic call about the missing swimmers. Now he was station chief, carrying his own share of guilt about the case that had never been solved. "Marcus," Ray said, settling into the passenger seat with 2 cups of coffee. "You look like hell." "I found something." Marcus handed him the note. Inside Sarah's whistle. It washed up yesterday. Ray studied the paper, frowning. The deep line. I remember something about that. There was an old cable survey from the 70s. Military installation, I think. Ran right through the middle of the bay. Military? Submarine communication line. They used to string cables along the ocean floor for long-range messaging. Most were decommissioned after satellite technology took over. Ray paused. But this one was different. Kept active longer than the others. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Where exactly? Ray pulled out his phone, accessing the Coast Guard database. Here's the thing that always bothered me about that day. The GPS logs from our search boats showed your swimmer's last known position was directly over that cable line, about 2 miles offshore, in deep water. 2 miles? That's impossible. The marker buoy was only half a mile out. I know. That's what made it so strange. Either our GPS was malfunctioning or... Ray's voice trailed off as he scrolled through the records. Jesus, Marcus, look at this. The screen showed a coastal survey map from 1992. A red line marked the submarine cable's path through Clearwater Bay. But when Ray pulled up the current nautical charts, the cable line was gone. Not just decommissioned, but erased from the official records entirely. That area is marked as a restricted zone now, Ray said quietly. Has been since 1993. Commercial fishing prohibited, recreational diving banned. No official reason given. Marcus stared at the map overlay, his mind racing. Ray, what if they didn't drown? What if something else happened out there? Before Ray could answer, his radio crackled to life. Station Chief, we've got reports of unusual acoustic activity in Sector 7G, same area as that old missing persons case. Ray and Marcus exchanged glances. Sector 7G was directly over where the submarine cable used to be, and where 6 teenagers had vanished exactly 20 years ago to the day. Section 4. Flashback. The team photo. August 15, 1992, 18:30 a.m. Marcus could still remember the weight of the camera in his hands as he lined up the shot. Team photos were tradition before big competitions. Something for the parents, something for the school trophy case, something to remember the moment before everything changed. "Everybody squeeze in," he'd called out. "Sarah, you're in the middle. Tommy, stop making faces. Danny, stand up straight." 6 swimmers in matching red and white warm-ups, the Clearwater Bay logo emblazoned across their chests. 6 young faces full of dreams and determination. 6 kids who trusted him completely. But now, sitting in his empty apartment 20 years later, Marcus stared at that same photo in disbelief. The frame sat on his mantel where it had always been. But something was wrong. Terribly wrong. There were only 5 swimmers in the picture. Marcus rubbed his eyes, certain he was seeing things. The guilt and sleepless nights were finally driving him insane. But no, he counted again. Sarah in the center, Tommy to her left, Beth and Jake on the right, little Danny kneeling in front. 5 swimmers, but there should have been 6. He grabbed the photo, examining it under the lamp. In the space between Tommy and Beth, where someone should have been standing, there was only a blurred smear, like the image had been deliberately obscured or had somehow faded beyond recognition. Marcus's hands shook as he pulled out his old coaching records, flipping through roster sheets and permission slips. 6 names, always 6 names. Sarah Chen, Tommy Martinez, Beth Morrison, Jake Sullivan, Amy Foster, Danny Park. But in the photo, Amy Foster had simply vanished. He rushed to his filing cabinet, pulling out newspaper clippings from 1992. Every article mentioned 6 missing swimmers. Every search report listed 6 names. But as he stared at the team photo, doubt crept into his mind like ice water. Had there always been 6 swimmers? Or had his memory, warped by guilt and trauma, created a 6th team member who never existed? Erickson picked up his phone to call Amy Foster's parents, then stopped. If Amy had never existed, what would they tell him? And if she had existed but was somehow being erased from memory and records, what did that mean? He looked at the photo one more time. In the blurred space where a 6th swimmer should have been, he could just make out the faint outline of a figure. Female, about 17, with shoulder-length dark hair. But her face was completely gone, as if she had never been there at all. Section 5. The Missing Logbook. Marcus had kept meticulous training records for 15 years. Every lap time, every technique note, every practice schedule was documented in his coaching logbooks. After the tragedy, he'd locked them away, unable to bear looking at the final entries. Now, breaking into the abandoned Clearwater Bay Marina office at 2 a.m., he needed those records more than ever. The marina had been closed since 2001, a victim of declining tourism after the disappearance made national news. But Marcus still had keys from his coaching days, and the rusted lock gave way easily. Inside, everything was exactly as he'd left it. His office, complete with outdated swimming posters and a chalkboard still showing the final. Practice schedule. August 15th, open water training. 6 swimmers, 8:45 a.m. departure. The logbooks sat in a dusty box, leather-bound volumes chronicling 5 years of coaching. Marcus found the 1992 book and opened it with trembling hands. The first thing he noticed was that pages were missing. Not torn out, too clean for that, but surgically removed. The binding showed gaps where pages had been carefully extracted. What remained was incomplete but telling. July entries showed 6 swimmers preparing for nationals. Training times, improvement, notes, team dynamics. But the final weeks of July were gone, along with all of August except for a single page. August 15th, 1992. The final entry was in his handwriting, but he didn't remember writing it. 45 a.m. Team departed for open water. Training. Weather conditions. Clear, calm seas. Visibility. Excellent. Team composition. 6 swimmers plus observer. Observer? Marcus stared at the word. He'd never brought observers to practice. It was against insurance regulations. Below that, indifferent. You Inc. was a note that made his blood run cold. 23 a.m. Lost visual contact with team. Fog bank approached from northwest. Attempted recall via whistle signal, no response. Water temperature dropped 15 degrees in 3 minutes. Acoustic anomaly. Detected at bearing 127 degrees. Acoustic anomaly? Marcus had no memory of writing those words or experiencing anything like that. At the bottom of the page, in handwriting so faded it was barely visible, was a final note. The water wasn't empty. But it was the margin note that made him drop. The logbook, scrawled in pencil, almost hidden in the binding. She came from below. The 7th one. Amy was never supposed to be there. Marcus stared at the note, his mind reeling. If Amy Foster had been some kind of observer or unauthorized addition to the team, it would explain why she was being erased from records. But it raised an even more terrifying question. What had brought her to the surface 20 years ago, and what had taken her back down? Section 6. Flashback, Fog, and Silence. August 15th, 1992, 9:15. a.m. The fog had come from nowhere, rolling across Clearwater Bay like a living thing. Marcus remembered standing on the dock, watching the gray wall swallow his swimmers as they approached the halfway point of their training circuit. "Sarah! Tommy! Turn around now!" His voice echoed across the water, but the fog muffled everything, making distances impossible to judge. That's when he'd heard the splashing, not the rhythmic stroke patterns of competitive swimmers, but frantic, desperate movements. Someone was in trouble. Marcus had grabbed the rescue kayak without hesitation, paddling hard toward where he'd last seen his team. The fog was so thick he could barely see the nose of his kayak, but he followed the sounds, splashing, gasping, what might have been voices calling for help. "Hold on, I'm coming," he'd shouted. Then, suddenly, silence. Complete, absolute silence. No, splashing. No voices, no sound at all except the gentle lap of waves against his kayak. Marcus had floated in that gray void, turning in circles, calling names until his voice was hoarse. That's when he'd seen the goggles. 6 pairs, floating in a perfect circle about 20 feet across. Empty goggles, as if the swimmers had simply vanished from inside them. But there was something else. A 7th pair, different from the team-issued equipment, older with a strange blue tint to the lenses. Marcus had reached for the nearest pair when something brushed against his leg underwater. Something big, moving fast. He'd looked down through the surprisingly clear water beneath the fog and seen it, a shadow, massive and elongated, gliding beneath his kayak. It was there for just a moment, then gone, leaving only a trail of disturbed water and the taste of copper in his mouth. The rescue boats had arrived 30 minutes later, but by then the fog had lifted and there was nothing to find. No swimmers, no goggles, no evidence that 6 teenagers had ever been in the water at all. Except for one thing Marcus had never told anyone. In the final moments before the Coast Guard arrived, he'd heard something that still woke him up screaming, 20 years later. Singing. A woman's voice, hauntingly beautiful, drifting up from the depths below. Not a cry for help, but something older, something that spoke of deep waters and secrets that should stay buried. And in that moment, Marcus had known with absolute certainty that whatever had taken his swimmers was still down there, waiting. Section 7. Present Day. Coastal Dredge Site. The construction crew at the new coastal development project didn't ask questions when Marcus showed up with Ray Vasquez and official Coast Guard credentials. They just pointed toward the massive dredging equipment that had been pulling debris from the bay floor for 3 months. "We're looking for anything unusual," Ray told the foreman. "Objects that might be related to an old missing persons case." The foreman, a weathered man named Pete Kowalski, nodded grimly. "You mean the concrete crate?" "Yeah, we pulled that up last week. Weirdest damn thing I've seen in 30 years of marine construction." He led them to a storage area behind the main equipment yard. There, sitting on a flatbed trailer, was a concrete enclosure about the size of a coffin, barnacle-encrusted and dripping, with seaweed. "Thing was sealed tight," Pete explained. "Took us 2 days with pneumatic hammers to crack it open. Contents were bone dry, perfectly preserved. Made no sense, being underwater that long." Ray examined the concrete shell. "How long would you estimate this was submerged? Based on the marine growth? 20 years, maybe more. But here's the thing. It was positioned directly over what used to be an old cable line. Found anchor points and cable fragments all around it." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. The submarine communication line, exactly where the GPS had tracked. His swimmer's final position. "What was inside?" he asked. Pete gestured to a separate container. "Personal effects. Swimming gear, mostly. Looked like team equipment." With trembling hands, Marcus opened the container. Inside were 6 swimming caps, still bright red and white despite their age. Each one had a name written in permanent marker. Sarah Chen, Tommy Martinez, Beth Morrison, Jake Sullivan, Danny Park, and Amy Foster. "There's one more thing," Pete said quietly. "Floated out when we cracked the main seal." He handed Marcus a 7th swimming cap, identical to the others, but with no name written on it. Instead, there were initials. A.F. But these weren't written in marker. They were embroidered in silver thread, professional and permanent. Marcus stared at the cap, his mind racing. Amy Foster's initials, but on equipment he'd never seen before. Equipment that suggested she'd been part of the team from the beginning, not an observer or unauthorized addition. "Pete," Ray said, "where exactly did you find this crate?" "GPS coordinates?" Pete consulted his tablet. "Latitude, 41.2847. Longitude, 71.8456, right at the bottom of what the old-timers call the deep hole. Water's about 200 feet there, drops off like a cliff." Marcus knew those coordinates. They were burned into his memory from 20 years of guilt and nightmares. The exact spot where Coast Guard sonar had detected the last traces of human activity before his swimmers vanished. But as they prepared to leave, Pete called out one more detail that made Marcus's blood run cold. "Oh, and gentlemen, that concrete crate? It wasn't sealed from the outside. The locks and latches were all on the interior. Whatever was in there. It was locked in from the inside, like they were trying to keep something else out." Section 8. Closing Beat. Echoes from the Water. Marcus returned to Clearwater Bay at midnight, drawn by something he couldn't name. The whistle hung around his neck, Sarah's whistle, the one that had started this impossible journey 20 years after. It should have been lost forever. The bay was calm, reflecting a full moon that turned the water into liquid silver. But there was something different about the silence tonight. It felt expectant, as if the water itself was holding its breath. Marcus walked to the end of the old dock, the same spot where he'd watched his swimmers dive in for the last time. The 7th swimming cap was in his pocket, the one with Amy Foster's embroidered initials. Amy Foster, the swimmer who existed in records and memories but not in photographs. The swimmer who might have been an observer, or might have been something else entirely. He pulled out the whistle and, almost without thinking, brought it to his lips. The sound that emerged was different from any whistle he'd ever heard, deeper, more resonant, carrying across the water like a voice calling from great depths. The response was immediate. Fog began to form in the center of the bay, not rolling, in from the horizon but materializing from the water itself. And in that fog, Marcus saw them. 7 figures, standing waist-deep in the silvery water. 6 he recognized immediately. Sarah, Tommy, Beth, Jake, Danny, Amy. They looked exactly as they had 20 years ago, unchanged by time or death. But the 7th figure made his heart stop. It was himself, Coach Marcus Whitaker, age 34, wearing the same red windbreaker he'd worn that fateful morning in 1992. The figure raised its hand in a wave, then pointed toward the shore. Marcus looked down and saw footprints in the sand, 7 sets, leading from the water's edge to where he stood. Fresh footprints, still damp with seawater. When he looked back up, the figures were gone. The fog was dissipating. But the whistle around his neck was warm to the touch, and he could swear he heard an echo of that haunting song he'd heard 20 years ago. Marcus understood now. The swimmers hadn't drowned. They'd found something in the deep water, something connected to that old submarine cable. And whatever it was, it had been calling to them, and to him, ever since. He walked back along the dock, following the 7 sets of footprints that led away from the water. But as he reached his truck, he realized something that made his hands shake as he reached for the keys. The footprints didn't stop at the shore. They continued across the parking lot, past his truck, and up the hill toward town, toward the homes where the parents of 6 missing swimmers still waited for answers they would never believe. Who had returned from the deep water of Clearwater Bay? And what were they coming back to claim?